ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, Minister Roche, Judge Fennelly. First, I'd like to say thank you very much to the Irish Society for European Law and the Institute for European Affairs for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to come and speak at home in Ireland, since I don't live here any longer. It's very nice to be back and to see familiar faces in the audience too, including some family members and my sister, with whom I'm so often confused these days, since we both speak about the European Union, and particularly the Lisbon Treaty, albeit from slightly different perspectives. So it's a pleasure to be here for lots of different reasons, but also because this is, as Minister Roche said, an important time for Ireland. But it's not just an important time for Ireland in discussing the future, Ireland's future in the EU and what to do about the Lisbon Treaty and the second referendum, but it's also an important time for the rest of the EU. Many of the member states are waiting anxiously for the outcome of this referendum. And it's that double feature of the current moment, the fact that the decision whether or not to ratify the Lisbon Treaty is of great importance for Ireland, but it's also of great importance for the rest of Europe. That's a feature of what I want to say tonight. It's one of the kind of elements that I think complicates the debate and leads in such a way to not so much to confusion, but there's a risk of distortion as a result of that feature, that what matters a lot to Ireland also matters a lot to the rest of the EU. So I want to talk about two different things in my talk. In the first part, I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of the current moment. You know, why are we here, just over a year after the first referendum, having a second referendum on the Lisbon Treaty? How did we get to this point, and whether there's a lot of unrest, I think popular unhappiness with that situation. I want to talk a bit about not so much the legitimacy of the second referendum as why it's taking place. And the second thing then is to go on to the Lisbon Treaty itself, and more particularly the guarantees that the government has secured recently, the political and legal guarantees, and to ask two different things really. The first is what the concerns were that those guarantees are seeking to respond to, and secondly, whether the guarantees adequately respond to those concerns. So first, the psychology of the present moment, I call it. How have we got to this stage? Well, most people know that the requirement for ratification of, the requirement for adopting EU amendment treaties is one of unanimity. So all member states of the EU have to ratify a treaty before it can come into effect. And it's the effect of that, the peculiar pressure that unanimity requirement applies on all of the member states, that explains the situation we're in at the moment, where there is a considerable amount of pressure on Ireland to ratify the treaty. It's especially true, I think, that where most or all other states have already ratified the treaty or in a position to ratify it, and one state has not ratified it. In a Europe of 27, there's a certain, not inevitability, but understandable reasonableness, shall we say, about the fact that the other states look closely at a negative vote in one state and ask why. You know, why did that state refuse to ratify? Because if that is the end of the matter, the treaty dies for all states. The treaty cannot come into force, even though it's of equal concern and of equal importance to all of the other 26 member states. So that's the curious pressure that the particular treaty amendment procedure in the EU imposes on all of the states who are ratifying it. Now, one of the responses then, the popular responses and media responses, I think, has been, but what is going on here? Don't the public, or don't the politicians understand that no means no? You know, whatever we say about ratification processes, about referenda being very, opportunities for all kinds of scaremongering and so on, they're nonetheless legitimate constitutional processes. The people said no, therefore the Lisbon Treaty should die. Why are we reconsidering the question again a year later? And it's true that if we think of, the EU isn't really unique in that respect, that it requires unanimity. The default rule in international law is that in order for a treaty to come into force, to be amended and so on, the unanimous consent of all states is required. So why is the EU so unusual in that respect, or is the EU so unusual in that respect? And what I want to say is that what is unusual about the EU are a number of things. One is that this is not just a question of one state wanting to join, making a decision that it's not going to join, and then the matter ending there. Because if we think about the EU, there have been situations where states have opted not to join. Norway, for example, after a referendum decided not to become a member. Was there undue pressure imposed? No. It doesn't happen like that. Switzerland chose not to join the European Economic Area. People, there's very little pressure in that situation for the state which has said no to join, because it doesn't affect the others in the same way. It's a question of will they become a member or not. But when we have a treaty like the Lisbon Treaty, which represents the product of years of negotiation, which contains a lot of important changes which will affect the EU as a whole and all of the states, then the situation is rather different. The states are all members of a close political community, and a change that one of them is refusing to agree to affects the others. And that's where the pressure comes from. Now, the second difference, I think, with regard to the EU, and it's not one that we often focus on, it's a little bit technical, but I think it's important, is that in international law, there is a procedure whereby states can unilaterally enter reservations to treaties. So a treaty is signed, it's agreed to by states, but then when it comes to the point where states individually are ratifying, if there is something that one state objects to, a peculiar position in the constitutional law of that state, they can enter a reservation, and they can do so unilaterally. They can register a unilateral reservation. That practice has not been possible within the EU. So, because of the nature of the EU as a close political community with all states committed to the same goals and the same rules, there never has been a practice of treaty reservations being unilaterally entered. It's a multilateral process, it's a collective process. Things are collectively negotiated. So the way in which the EU to date has responded to the kind of situation we have now, where one state is claiming particular interests, which it is, feels are threatened by a treaty, there are two ways in which the EU responds. The first is by what we call differentiated integration. There's all kinds of strange names for this, but variable geometry, differentiated integration. What it means is that during the course of negotiating the treaty, the particular concerns of the state are built in. So we saw this most dramatically around the time of the Maastricht Treaty, where Britain got an opt-out from economic and monetary union and social policy. We saw it at the time of the Amsterdam Treaty, where Ireland and Britain got opt-outs of various kinds from justice and home affairs. And now we have provisions on closer cooperation for all kinds of different policy areas. So in other words, the problem we're facing at the moment in Ireland of one state's particular concerns and then the EU's general wish to go ahead with a particular treaty are usually accommodated in that way. Now that didn't happen this time with the Lisbon Treaty because Ireland didn't foresee any particular concerns of the kind that were raised during the referendum and didn't raise them, they hadn't been the subject of particular opt-outs. So what has evolved, I think, in the EU as a result of the lack of a unilateral reservation system as there is in international law, and this attempt to accommodate the concerns of one state, is what we've seen with the Edinburgh Declaration for Denmark at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, and again the recent decision of the European Council in relation to Ireland, and that is an attempt to somehow accommodate retrospectively, as we're after the fact, after the treaty has been concluded and there is no opt-out, to somehow accommodate the concern of that state. So that, I think, that curious combination of features about the EU as a close political organisation explain why we are, just over a year from the last referendum, facing a situation where Ireland, unlike the constitutional treaty, which once rejected by France and the Netherlands was abandoned as a constitutional treaty, unlike that situation, we are facing it wasn't as if after the Lisbon Treaty was rejected last year, everyone decided the Lisbon Treaty can be no more. Instead, Ireland was encouraged to go and find out what was wrong, what did the referendum results reflect, and then find a way for the EU to respond to those concerns. And the reason for that pressure, and the reason for that attempt to find a resolution, I think, is because the Lisbon Treaty reflects a treaty that was negotiated over a very long time. It contains many reforms which were, some of them I think I've referred to as taboos of the integration process that were broken, things like a single legal personality for the EU, accession to the ECHR, and various other reforms, things that had been attempted many times, but agreement had never been reached on them. They had finally been reached, and so there were all kinds of important changes that were going to come about, and to allow the treaty to fall because of the outcome of a referendum in one state, the other member states were not willing to let that happen and asked Ireland to reconsider and so on. So that's by way of explanation of what I call the psychology of the current moment. We can argue, that it's illegitimate, that there is a provision for unanimous ratification, and there isn't unanimity here, so the matter should rest there. But as I've said, the political pressures, the reality is that there's a great deal at stake for all the member states. in a treaty like the Lisbon Treaty, and there's an attempt being made to reconcile Ireland's concerns as reflected in the no vote with the desire for the states for the treaty to come into force, or not just to end. So moving on from the psychology of the process to the Lisbon Treaty itself. I'm not going to say a lot actually about the substance of the Lisbon Treaty, because I want to say a little bit more instead about the concerns and then the guarantees that responded to them. But in brief, the Lisbon Treaty, I think it's fair to say the Lisbon Treaty contains a large amount of the substance of the failed constitutional treaty. And the reason for that is that the no votes to the constitutional treaty were analysed and interpreted in general as a no to the constitutional ambition that was reflected in that treaty. So the no was not to many of the reforms contained in the treaty, but to the idea of Europe having a constitution, the implication that it was some kind of superstate. So that's how the French and Dutch no votes were interpreted, and that's why the Lisbon Treaty, that was redrafted from the remains of the constitutional treaty, as it were, contains many of the substantive reforms that were considered to be valuable, while abandoning the symbolism, the language, and some of the clauses, for example, on supremacy and on a flag, on an anthem, and so on, that were seen to reflect the constitutional ambition. So what are the good things that the Lisbon Treaty contains? Well, in brief, I've divided them into internal and external reforms, but the internal reforms, again, many people will be familiar with these. It strengthens many of the quasi-democratic features of the EU's functioning. So there's a stronger role for the European Parliament, an extension of the co-decision procedure, which gives the Parliament a co-equal role with the Council in lawmaking. It gives legal effect to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It brings the area of freedom, security and justice within, it's not right to use this language anymore, within the first pillar, but what that means is it puts that policy area on a footing with other areas of EC policy, subject to the jurisdiction of the court, subject to the European Parliament having a co-equal role and so on. So it improves that area of policy making considerably. Unlike some of the other reform treaties, I think the Lisbon Treaty, and this is an interesting feature of it, doesn't contain any major new policy expansion. So unlike the Maastricht Treaty, which brought in EMU, economic and monetary union, but also lots of other substantive policy areas, the Lisbon and Amsterdam, which brought in really freedom, security and justice in a very significant way. The Lisbon Treaty, the only two new, but they're not really new policy areas mentioned are climate change and energy policy, which are areas that most people think are very important for the EU to take an active role in. So it's not a treaty that seeks to expand policy areas of European competence, but rather a lot of it is institutional reform and other things like strengthening the role of national parliaments, the subsidiarity mechanism and so on, go towards a lot of the legitimacy concerns that people had about the EU in the past. So that's some of the internal reforms. Externally, I think it also makes important changes, strengthening Europe's capacity to play a global role, not in extremely strong ways, but nonetheless all heading in the direction of strengthening Europe's role. A longer-term president of the European Council, for example, a minister for foreign affairs, but not under that name, now called the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, single legal personality, a strengthened role for the European Parliament in international treaty making and so on, a stronger solidarity clause. So in all sorts of ways, there are internal and external reforms that I think are positive for the EU and for Ireland as part of the EU. But nonetheless, the Lisbon Treaty was rejected, and that's the fact we're facing. That's why we're having this discussion tonight. The Lisbon Treaty was rejected by the Irish people in a referendum. And with the help of various analysts commissioned by the government, and similar results came out of other analysis conducted by the European Union's own Eurobarometer polls, which the Synod and the WCD also carried out an analysis, and the kinds of issues which came to the fore, which were analysed also by the Oireachtas subcommittee, were those that the legal guarantees have focused on, and that is the loss of an Irish commissioner, fears of undermining Irish neutrality, fears of corporation tax rates being harmonised, fears of the impact on Irish abortion law, family rights, education rights, and more generally a cluster of fears about social policy concerns being undermined. And so these were identified through empirical analysis of the no vote as being the concerns, the reasons why people voted no. And then the government went and secured these three-part guarantees, the legal guarantees, and then political guarantees on the Commissioner, and lastly a kind of a reassurance on social policy concerns. So what I want to ask is, first of all, and this is probably most of what I'm going to say, is whether these fears and concerns were actually justified by the Lisbon Treaty. Were they properly raised by the Lisbon Treaty? Did the Lisbon Treaty really threaten these things? And then the second question would be, do the legal guarantees really address them? On the loss of an Irish Commissioner, I think everyone recognises the Lisbon Treaty did not threaten, it was not the Lisbon Treaty that was bringing about the loss of a permanent Commissioner for every member state. That was going to happen in any case under the existing EC Treaty rules. Once the EU reaches 27, the number of Commissioners was to be reduced. The Lisbon Treaty simply specified what the rotation mechanism was and set a date for that coming into effect. So the Lisbon Treaty was not going to be responsible for the loss of an Irish Commissioner. Nonetheless, the political guarantee secured by the government has promised that if the Lisbon Treaty comes into force, the system of one Commissioner per state will be retained. And that is possible under a particular reading of the Lisbon Treaty. So actually, no, the Lisbon Treaty didn't threaten one Commissioner per member state, but the guarantee secured by the government promises that at least for the medium term, that the system of one Commissioner per member state will be retained. With the other concerns, Irish neutrality, education rights, abortion, social rights, and social policy more generally, and corporation tax, do the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty undermine or threaten to undermine these concerns? My reading of the Lisbon Treaty, and based on my knowledge of the EU, is that no, the Lisbon Treaty doesn't in any way threaten, make more likely, or exacerbate the risk that these aspects of Irish law and policy will be undermined. Now, without explaining why, because that would be another lengthy lecture, without explaining why that is, I just want to say the following. If that's true, you might think, well then, what are the guarantees about? Am I saying this is all a phantom? People are wrong, they don't understand the treaty, they don't understand European integration, and all this time has been wasted on the guarantees. No, I'm not saying that. The situation is actually quite complicated, complex. And what it is that what the concerns that were raised at the time of the Lisbon referendum are about is about more general concerns about the process of European integration. People legitimately fear that the process of European integration, with this deeply integrated system of legal and economic and judicial and political integration, has in some ways affected these various issues, has affected Irish law on and the situation in Ireland relating to family life, abortion, social rights, corporation tax, and so on. And that the Lisbon Treaty represents another step in that process of European integration. So in a more diffuse way, it doesn't focus particularly on what Lisbon does. The reaction, the no vote to Lisbon, insofar as it relates to these concerns, was about the general process of European integration undermining these aspects of Irish social, political life and law and so on, and not so much the particular provisions of the treaty itself. And I think it's unquestionably true that European integration has affected all of these areas of Irish life in certain ways. Joining the EU has brought lots of benefits to Ireland, all kinds of benefits. But with benefits come change. Sometimes change in itself is uncomfortably beneficial, but also it entails losses and costs as well as benefits. So we gain rights as Irish citizens to travel to other states, to live there, to work. Many of us really benefit from those rights. But at the same time, it means that citizens of other states have the right to come here, to live, to work, to be treated equally. So yes, it affects aspects of our immigration law. Yes, it affects aspects of social law. In order for companies to enjoy freedom of establishment within the EU, they have to be treated equally with companies under national law. That means that aspects of national corporation law have been changed and adjusted. Aspects of national taxation law have had to change and be adjusted. So these aren't phantom fears in any broader sense. All of these areas of law and policy are affected by the process of European integration. But the question is more whether the Lisbon Treaty in particular was likely to affect them. Even though at the more general level of the process of European integration and the way in which it affects these areas, let's take the one that's seems to come up so regularly and to touch on a very raw nerve in Ireland, but that no amount of reassurance seems to really quieten these fears, and that's abortion law. does EU law threaten Irish abortion law? Well, I would say the main changes to Irish abortion law that have come about since Ireland's membership of the European Community have come not from the European Union, but from the European Convention on Human Rights. And in fact, many of you will know there are more cases pending at the moment challenging Ireland's laws on abortion before the European Court of Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights is a separate system from the EU, which was signed and joined separately by Ireland, which was incorporated by Ireland through mechanisms that have nothing to do with the EU or with the EU law. And yes, the pressure that I think judgments of the Court of Human Rights and the Open Door Council in particular imposed in Ireland led to changes to the Irish Constitution. Now those were voluntary changes to the Irish Constitution introduced by Irish people through a referendum, but yes, they opened up the possibility for it to be lawful under the Constitution for Irish women to travel to other states to receive abortions, to receive information and counselling and so on in Ireland. So yes, changes to Irish laws on abortion have come about through Ireland's membership of Europe more broadly, the Council of Europe, not the European Union. But that's the kind of change, in my view, that being a member of a closely integrated community, a community that brings all kinds of change through pressure coming from Irish citizens as well as from outside. But EU law has had very little, if anything, to do with Irish abortion law. To the extent that it did at one point, there was a question about whether free movement of people to receive health services in another state would touch on Irish abortion law. The EU avoided that through a particular manoeuvre, but that in itself, that strategy or that fear that EU law might sometime down the road come back to that issue again, was addressed in a protocol attached to the Maastricht Treaty many years ago of Ireland, which says nothing in the EC treaties, will affect the application of the constitutional provisions in Ireland relating to the rights of the unborn. So it's a complex area of law, but it's one which I think it's fair to say that EU law has very little to do with Irish abortion law. The likelihood of the Lisbon Treaty affecting that is minuscule in the extreme. I find it very difficult to imagine a scenario in which it would, but nonetheless it's one of those recurrent concerns, and you can see why. It's not irrational to see the concern, because it is somehow to do with Ireland's membership of a broader European community and the pressure for change from within and without that brings about. Similarly with the other aspects of family life, education rights, corporation tax and so on, it is membership of the EU that affect, there is the risk that membership of the EU will affect these in different ways. The Lisbon Treaty does not particularly affect them, but generally EU rules, the approach of the European Court of Justice, the approach of the legislature at different times has expanded into these fields. And so, yes, in some ways the issue of corporation tax exemplifies my point quite well, that the benefits and the costs are sometimes related to the same sort of change, that Irish people fear that the EU will harmonise rules on corporation tax and take away the advantages Ireland gains from being able to set a lower rate of corporation tax for companies. But in fact, much of the gain that Ireland obtains from having low rates of corporation tax is related to being a member of the EU, because the reason why American companies want to locate here is to gain not just low rates of corporation tax, but thereby gain access to the whole of the EU market. So these things, the costs and benefits, are connected very often, and in a sense, that there's a sense in which sometimes people want the benefits of the EU and none of the costs or none of the adjustments that requires or that would bring about. So, having said that, do the Irish guarantees respond to these concerns? Well, as you've seen, what I'm trying to say is that the Lisbon Treaty itself doesn't sharpen these concerns as far as I'm concerned. That the Lisbon Treaty itself does not change any of these areas. And what the guarantees do, in a sense, is to say that. Apart from the guarantee relating to the Commission, the political promise, that's a real promise. It's a political one rather than a legal one, but it's highly impossible to imagine that will not take place if the Lisbon Treaty comes into effect. The reassurance on social policy is simply a reassurance, a declaration. The legal guarantees in the centre that relate to corporation tax neutrality and social rights and abortion and so on state that the Lisbon Treaty will not change Irish law on these matters. The Lisbon Treaty will not change the European Union's capacity to harmonise rates of corporation tax. That exists already. It requires unanimous action on the part of the states, but they have not chosen to do it. Ireland, as one of the states, has not chosen to move, nor have the others. But The guarantees don't say, we will never, or the EU can never. They couldn't do that. So the idea of the guarantees tying the EU's hands forever in ways that are unrelated to the content of the Lisbon Treaty, no, that's not what they're securing. What they're doing is saying these concerns are not raised or exacerbated by the Lisbon Treaty. Nothing in the Lisbon Treaty threatens these areas of concern. So to bring my comments to a close, just to say that, on the one hand, what I want to say is that the Lisbon Treaty did not raise these concerns, but neither were they irrational or phantom concerns, because the process of European integration undeniably do put pressure on all of the different areas that were mentioned in different ways, in sometimes much more minor ways, sometimes much more significant ways. But one of the problems with the ratification process is that it becomes treaty referendum processes to ratify European treaties become one of the few occasions in which there's a real public debate about the EU. And so all of the opposition to particular European policies, opposition to particular trends and so on, are channeled into referendum debates on particular treaties, even when they have very little to do with those treaties themselves. This was true of the constitutional treaty debate in France and the Netherlands, true of the Lisbon Treaty debate in Ireland, and the Nice debate also, I would say, in Ireland previously. And one of the problems about I have very mixed feelings about referenda, because on the one hand, I think they're a great way to get public debate going on the European Union, to make people focus on the way in which new law affects, Irish law affects our lives, affects change and so on, and gets a real public debate going. On the other hand, they become very skewed in many ways. There's opportunities for scaremongering. The debate gets very disconnected from what the treaty is about. And they become a focus, most of all, I think, for channeling discontent about particular policies into a generalised kind of Euroscepticism, into opposition to any treaty as a way of signalling discontent about something else. So the real problem, as far as I'm concerned, and one I'm not going to resolve here tonight, is what is the proper forum for channeling concerns, people's legitimate concerns about these aspects of European integration, if not, the amount of time and energy that seems to be distracted, in my view, into these debates on the legal guarantees and so on. There are some legitimate concerns arising. They're not to do with the Lisbon Treaty in particular. And one of the problems is, of course, that the European Union is peculiarly depoliticised. The politics of the European Union is curiously depoliticised. It's very difficult for people to get involved, to see where issues are decided, to understand how the European Parliament, or voting for any particular person for the European Parliament, might affect the content of a particular law one way or another. There's an absence of a European public political sphere. There are no real European political parties, there are only some embryonic parties and groupings and so on. And this, in my view, is the real problem and the real concern, and it's only a pity that the treaty ratification process become kind of surrogate for a proper European politics and European public sphere. So I think I've gone on for long enough, and I'll hand over to Professor Laffan.
There's much of Professor de Búrca's paper that I agree with. What I will offer, I'm a political scientist rather than a lawyer. We tend to live in different realms, we look at different things, and what I will offer is a different analysis of how we got to where we got, not a complementary one in many ways. And I'd like to structure what I have to say on the base, if this works. Yeah. Firstly, to look at, Professor de Búrca talked about the psychological moment. Well, in my view, we've got to where we've got because there are three intersecting dynamics. Those are the outside-in dynamics, what's happening in the EU and what that means for Ireland, the dynamics within Ireland, and then how Ireland responds to that dynamic. And all three dynamics have produced where we are today and the fact that we're going to vote again. I want to deal with the outcome of those dynamics, the new deal that Ireland has got, to ask, is it worth asking the electorate to think again? Is it something that it is, that it is legitimate, but also there are compelling reasons to ask the Irish electorate again? I would argue that there are. And then I'd say very little about Ireland and integration, but I do, I think, want to have somewhat of a check on what I perceive as the extraordinary dissonance between the way we discuss democracy in the EU and the absence of outrage at domestic level to some of the problems of our domestic democracy. And finally, I'll say something about the future of the EU itself. So firstly, on to those dynamics, the multi-level dynamics. No? This is... Yeah. So, firstly, this is The Economist the week after Ireland voted no. Just bury it. The Lisbon Treaty is dead. And here is the poster that greeted President Sarkozy, who was then President of the European Union, when he came to Ireland last July. Basically, we have to ask, the Irish government was faced with a rejection of an amendment that it had put to the people, and a rejection in a referendum is an important political event. Should it have taken the advice that was offered to it by Sinn Féin before going to the June European Council last year? And I want to recall for us what that advice was. Sinn Féin said to the Irish government, met the Irish government in fact, and said, the people have now spoken and the Lisbon Treaty is over. The ratification process should now end and the leaders of the EU 27 member states must now negotiate a new treaty. Now that is the proposition put to the Irish government by one of the only parliamentary party that was against the Lisbon Treaty. Unlike Sinn Féin, however, the Irish government, in my view, had to navigate those three dynamics. The dynamic of the domestic rejection, the dynamic of the other member states in the EU, and the dynamic of how to manage those two in that interrelationship. And I don't think the Irish government could have gone, that the Taoiseach could have gone in June last year and said to the other member states, sorry, that's it. The Irish people have spoken, and that is the end of the story. In other words, just bury it. I don't think an Irish government would have been acting in the interests of the Irish state and people if it did so, nor do I think it would have been acting as a member state of the European Union. Because one of the things we've learned, and it's a pretty painful process, is that to be a member state means that political systems are no longer contained in containers. We are no longer absolved from responsibility to other member states. To be a member state is different. It carries with it not just legal and constitutional responsibilities, it also carries with it a responsibility of being a member state. In terms of these are this is the UK Independence Party, our new friends in the EU, telling the EU to respect the Irish vote. Now, I have to say that I'm a little concerned about uses of words like pressure and refusal of the other member states. Because in my view, the word pressure implies compulsion, coercion and bullying. The word refusal implies negativity, rejection and repudiation. The EU political system is extraordinarily consensus-driven. It is hardwired to deal with the deep diversity that is the EU, and it is hardwired to deal with member state problems. This is not a system that repudiates, it's not a system that bullies, and it's not a system that engages in rejection, either of the governments of the member states or of their body polities. It is a highly responsive political system, much more responsive, in fact, than majoritarian democratic systems would be, where if you win by majority, you win and it's all over. And I think I want to recall for us tonight how the EU reacted to the first major institutional and constitutional challenge that it faced in 1965. In 1965, the most powerful political leader in Europe, Charles de Gaulle, from the most powerful political country in the EU, literally walked out of the EU system. La chaise vide, the empty chair, they upped and out. Now, on the following Monday morning, the other 5 member states met as they were scheduled to do, and they had absolutely no idea how they were going to react. Should they just close shop and decide that's it? Should they agree to de Gaulle's requirement to reopen the Rome Treaty as he asked? What should they do? Well, what the EU did then, and this is where I think that this is how the EU responds, it did 2 things. It firstly protects the system. It keeps the show on the road. Why? Because the EU system is an extraordinarily new social and political construction. If we think of nation states, our products of the 19th and 20th century, the EU is a very young political construction. So keeping the show on the road is not faceless Brussels bureaucrats trying to impose on the peoples of Europe. Rather, it is a systemic necessity to keep what is a reasonably fragile system together. So what did they do? They waited 6 months while the French while the French debated in Paris as to how they would find their way back. And eventually, a gentleman's agreement in Luxembourg in January 1966, no treaty renegotiation, but the veto for the French. So the French came back in. So I would argue that from then, this is not something new that's happened in European integration. This is something that is very hardwired within the system. So what happened then within Ireland? What does an Irish government do when it's faced with what is a serious rejection of a proposition that it puts to its people? Well, the first thing the government decided to do is it better try to understand why. And it commissioned probably the most intensive and extensive piece of research on voting behaviour, on why the Irish voted no, who voted no, and what could be learned from that. And I think that research gives us, and I don't know if my colleague Richard Sinnott is here, but he's the one who he knows this material in a very nuanced way. But I give you my 4 takes on what it tells us. Firstly, it gives us a very good profile on the electorate, the hard yes, hard no, soft yes and soft no. Within no, it gives a very good profile of who voted no. Secondly, it gives us a very good feel on the importance of lack of knowledge and understanding, both for those who voted no and those who abstained. It raises specific concerns of the Irish electorate in terms of, as Professor de Búrca listed them. And finally, it said that over 60% of the Irish electorate wanted Ireland to remain fully involved in the EU. So, in other words, the fully involved in the EU have to be married somewhat with the outcome. The second important development in last year was the role of the Oireachtas, because direct democracy through referendums is, unless you are living in Switzerland, is something that's used very rarely in most political systems, and in ours predominantly in relation to our constitution. Representative democracy is how we govern ourselves day to day, year to year. And the Oireachtas looked at the issues, and the quality of deliberation in that Oireachtas committee was very high. I think there was over 110 witnesses. It's all the podcasts are there for anyone to see. I was very struck by the quality of the questioning, but also the quality of the deliberation. And the Parliament ended by saying, in our name, that Ireland's decision not to ratify the Lisbon Treaty has made the country's long-term position at the core of the European Union considerably less certain. That was the settled will of a large group of Irish parliamentarians, having spoken to a lot of groups and looked at a lot of issues. It didn't say there should be a second referendum at the time. It merely said that there were issues that the EU had to accommodate, and that the other member states should accommodate these. So then that brings us to how the NESC was asked to do a review of Ireland's economic interaction with the EU. I think given the collapse of the economy, they haven't quite got around to finishing their report. In terms of the inside-out dynamics, and this is where what happened within Ireland and the views of the other member states come together, was in what I would call the role of the European Council as a staging post. The European Council was all the heads of governments of the member states, including one head of state, coming together, looking at how this could be resolved. The Irish government engaged in multiple bilateralism, and by that I mean with intensive bilateral interaction with all of the other member states. Particularly, and I just quote for you from Micheál Martin to the Oireachtas European Affairs Committee in December, when he said, "I had a series of bilateral meetings in recent weeks with colleagues from Germany, Italy, Sweden, Portugal and Spain. The Taoiseach met representatives of Finland and Sweden, and next week we'll visit Germany, the United Kingdom, Luxembourg and France." And that, under the radar, multiple bilateralism has been going on all of the time from last June until now. It was a process, in my view, driven and managed by the Irish government. This was not an imposition from the outside. This is not the other member states coming to say, because this system operates, in fact, in a very different way. Now, what was the outcome of this dynamic? The outcome was the New Deal that Ireland got. And what was that New Deal? And we can debate the nature and dimensions of that New Deal. I would argue that the Irish effectively got everything that they asked for. They got the Commission. Ireland got a guarantee of a commissioner per member state. They got legal guarantees on the areas that Professor de Búrca looked at. Now, the question of whether legal guarantees were necessary, given that the fact, I fully agree with you that the Lisbon Treaty didn't have an impact on corporate tax. Legal guarantees were necessary in order to mobilise the issue off the agenda. Otherwise, we would be back the next time we look at the Lisbon Treaty talking about corporate tax yet again. So it was really important that these were legal guarantees, and then obviously the declaration on workers' rights. They provide an opportunity for us in this country now to have a debate, the debate that we didn't have the last time on the content of the Lisbon Treaty itself. Now, why did the government go down this route in looking for? Firstly, we must remember that the Irish government was also, and state, was a signatory of this treaty. That the Irish government clearly wouldn't have signed up for it unless, in the first place, unless they felt it was a reasonable deal for Ireland. Not only that, but most of it was negotiated during an Irish presidency of the EU. I suspect, but don't know, that when the historical archives of this period are known, that there will be a paper somewhere in the system that asks, could Ireland have got a better deal? And on any objective analysis, there is no way that Ireland would have gone in to a renegotiated treaty format and got a better deal. We would be weaker in the negotiations, we wouldn't be in the chair, we would have had the no, and there is no way that there was a better deal available for Ireland. Secondly, and this is one of the things that is extraordinarily absent from the debate so far, the only way that we as a country can retain control over our future in the European Union is to revisit this issue. It is the only way that it is in our hands. In a reopened treaty, a renegotiated treaty, all of the other issues of other member states would have come to the fore and would have jostled for time and attention politically. So there is no doubt that it is important in terms of Ireland's European policy. And finally, the context has changed extraordinarily. We may have felt in June last year that the best of Ireland's European engagement was past. We may have felt that it was more important to our past than our future. If we have had if anything has given us an understanding of just how critical it is to us, has been the response of the ECB in terms of the economic crisis. The largest provider of liquidity to the Irish financial system today is the ECB, and it provides more to us than any other member state. And all you have to do, and it isn't very popular to say so, is contrast Ireland's experience with that of Iceland. And I don't do that lightly. Icelandic assets in the United Kingdom were taken by the UK government under their anti-terrorism legislation. That could not have been done had Iceland been a member state of the EU. So I think it provided us, at least in a very real sense, with an understanding of the interdependencies that we have. And then, no, I can't. Yeah, is Lisbon worth it? Is it worth? Because there is a democratic dilemma asking us to vote again. It's not an easy thing for all of us to have to go and grapple with this issue again. I would argue that any European treaty should be looked at in terms of, firstly, normatively, is it better than what exists? Does it enhance or weaken the democratic fabric of the EU? And does it help the EU face the challenges that it faces? Firstly, in terms of the normative underpinnings of integration. There's no doubt that Titles 1 and 2, Articles 1 to 12, establish in a very real way what the values of this system are. And they're as inspirational, if you read them, as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Charter also matters. The treaty is also much clearer in terms of the separation of power and the assignment of power to different levels of the EU. The treaty meets the test in terms of enhancing the democratic fabric of the Union, both in terms of the European Parliament, the citizens' petitions, and also in terms of national parliaments. And finally, the challenges facing the EU. I would argue that now the challenges facing integration are not Ireland's relationship with the EU. It is how this very small continent, which will very soon be less than 6% of the global population, deals with a very different and emerging political economy. It really is about the role of the EU in the world and its capacity to deal with issues like energy policy and climate change. Also, we need to remember, and here I'll just very quickly move to the future of the EU itself. We take, I think, students of integration should always be attentive to the capacity for disintegration in a system. And our debate in the autumn will take place in the shadow of the next British election. And there's no doubt that the most likely government to emerge from that is a Conservative-led government in the United Kingdom, which will have a very strong Eurosceptic underpinning. It would be a mistake of historical proportion if this country was the beginning of the pulling of a thread that had very serious consequences for the EU, an EU that I would argue Europe needs. The second potential is, so decay and disintegration should never be underestimated. It is a robust system, but just how robust will always be tested. The second is that sense in here, that awful word cosmopolitanization, that's a translation of a German word. It sounds better in German than it does in English and probably should have been left. Basically, the argument is that if only the EU could have normal politics, if only you could have left and right and a government and we kick the rascals out, everything would be fine. That is not an available Europe. The EU is not a standard, if we, by standard democracy, say it's a domestic democracy, in the European terms. Politicization, the EU actually has become extraordinarily politicized, and there is no doubt that party politics plays a very important role in the European Parliament. But there isn't a European public sphere available to us just like that. There isn't. The ties that bind us within our member states are strong. They're stronger than those that tie us across the member states. So the idea that somehow or other we can, and again we need to be historical and think of how nation states evolved. Nation states took extraordinarily lengths of time to have the institutional and constitutional fabric of a democracy. The EU, as Robert Dahl, that great student of democracy, argues, is the only place in the world where there is an incipient transnational democracy. But that transnational democracy will be built through contestation and consensus building and institution building. It's not, there's no DOS manual that we can take off the shelf that will give it to us overnight. I would argue that what we're seeing in the EU at the moment is the EU is approaching treaty equilibrium. There is no energy in the system for more treaties. There is certainly no energy in this country for more European treaties. We've run out of steam. It is approaching equilibrium for now. I don't think if Lisbon is passed that you'll see another European reform treaty for at least 10 to 15 years, but you will have ongoing organic change, and it's that organic change that I think we need to look at. Finally, before I finish, I just want to say something very quickly, if I have I probably have 5 minutes, on Ireland and European integration. It was extraordinary during the last referendum campaign. The mixture was a mixture of both hubris and fear. Hubris, we don't need the EU anymore. Fear, it's going to gobble us, it's going to gobble us up. Notwithstanding 36 years of EU membership, knowledge of the EU among the Irish electorate is low, and given our historical experience, it's very easy to promote a narrative of large versus small, the EU as other rather than us, the EU as draining of our sovereignty, the EU as a major military power in the making, and the EU as a large, undemocratic leviathan. There is nothing in 36 years of Ireland's membership of the EU that would allow us to reach that conclusion. And it is always serious in a society when there's a cognitive dissonance between the historical experience and what we think has happened. We have no reason to feel in any way that the EU is out to get us or out to bully us. And this I feel particularly strong about, and it's probably a sense of sort of, when I look at what we have experienced as a society over the last 20 years, we've had the Beef Tribunal, the planning tribunals, the scandal of the blood transfusion service, the Ryan report on industrial schools, and the extraordinary institutional failure that has led to where we find ourselves as an economy and society. I think that the democratic challenges, and they are there, that face the EU, pale in comparison to the democratic challenges that face us as a state and society. We have a pervasive weakness of accountability in our society and in our body politic. And frankly, I would prefer we used some of the political energy that we put into attacking the dangerous leviathan that is the EU to actually sorting out our own house. But that's a very personal view. And finally, can I say that the Skibbereen Eagle said one time to Lord Palmerston that it's got its eye on him and on the Emperor of Russia. Can I end by saying that Europe's eyes will be on Ireland on the 2nd of October as we think again about the Lisbon Treaty. I think we have an absolute political responsibility to deal with Lisbon as it is rather than as the myths about it. We have an absolute political responsibility and a cultural responsibility to interrogate our experience of EU membership and to ask whether or not what is a modest but important reform treaty for the EU deserves the support of the Irish electorate.